and I am the Global Advocacy Manager at Waterkeeper Alliance. And welcome to the Solutions to Plastic Pollution webinar series. This is a more or less monthly webinar series that we are doing, Waterkeeper Alliance, in conjunction with the Plastic Pollution Coalition, Surfrider, Captain Planet Foundation, US PIRG, Environment America, One More Generation, League of Conservation Voters, and others. So stay tuned for additional webinars coming up on the topic of plastic pollution. Today we're in for a real treat because we have two experts in the field, Jane Patton with the Center for International Environmental Law, and Christopher Chin with the Center for Oceanic Awareness, Research, and Education. Plastic pollution is a global environmental crisis. It's driven by increased production of petrochemicals, reliance on single-use plastic products, and poor waste management practices, and many other factors as well. By now, we've all seen information about the widespread impacts of plastic pollution, and we know that plastic does not biodegrade in the environment, and in fact, it can persist for hundreds of years, if not longer, polluting our oceans, rivers, beaches, communities, and even our bodies. We've heard about the oceanic gyres that concentrate the plastic pollution, and the scale of the problem is enormous. But that is just the end of the life cycle of plastics. We also know that there are very immediate impacts to human health and ecosystems from the chemicals in the plastic and the long list of additives, and of course from microplastics. Nowhere is this more prevalent than with frontline and fence line communities that are located near the production and incineration sites. So we're beginning to see how recycling of plastic pollution, recycling of plastic is a functional falsehood. It's just barely working enough to get people to feel okay about buying more plastic. But it's not really dealing with the circularity or in limiting of plastic pollution or waste. So it's a systemic problem, it's a global problem, and it needs a systemic global solution. So today we're in for a treat. We're going to hear from two of the pillars of the movement to address this problem through a binding global plastics treaty. Fortunately, we have many pillars and strong leaders in this movement, but today we're going to hear from Jane Patton with the Center for International Environmental Law and Christopher Chin with the Center for Oceanic Awareness, Research, and Education. So we're going to start off with Christopher, and I will go ahead and introduce him. So Christopher Chin is the executive director at COARE. He is an internationally recognized expert in ocean policy and conservation issues. He's provided testimony to various governing and legislative bodies in the US and Canada, and has addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations with regard to issues concerning the health of our oceans. He has authored, supported, and defended laws affecting ocean health and resources, and is considered one of North America's foremost experts in shark fin policy and single-use plastics legislation. He's worked on California's Marine Life Protection Act and marine protected areas along California's north central coast. So take it away, Christopher. He's going to tell us about what he's doing. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks so much, Gabby. And I'm excited to be here with you all and to share the stage with my dear friend, Jane. We've been working on this issue for a super long time, and we're excited to see that it is where it is. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the global approach. Obviously, plastic pollution is a global issue. We see it everywhere. It is literally in every cubic centimeter of water on the face of the earth. We'll talk about what multilateral environmental agreements are, or some examples. We'll talk about the UN Environment Assembly, the process of and history of the plastic pollution treaty, the idea of it, and how we got to where we are. And then we'll talk about some challenges and literally how we change the world. So obviously, plastic pollution is a global issue. We need to and can and should work on local and regional and state and national issues, but it's obviously a global issue that requires a global approach and global solutions. And that's where we're coming into play here. So multilateral environmental agreements, you would know them as treaties. This is the most common idea of it, the most common form of an MEA. The one that most people are familiar with is the Paris Agreement on climate, the Minamata Convention on mercury, Basel Convention on transboundary waste. These are all things that are relatively familiar to us, and the concept of the world coming together and agreeing on principles and ideas and limits and things like that. And that's the same thing that we're trying to do with plastic and plastic pollution. So the United Nations Environment Assembly is the highest level body governing and making rules on the environment. And it comprises all 193 member states of the United Nations, and it convenes roughly every 2 years in Nairobi, which is the headquarters of the UN Environment Program. And this is where some of these decisions are made and ideas are formed. And there's a lot of preparation that goes in and around these meetings. So even as far back as the first UN Environment Assembly in 2014, we've been talking about plastic pollution and pollution in the ocean. That's where the concept first started. You know, we've all seen that video of the turtle with a straw in its nose. So back in the first UN Environment Assembly, the Resolution 6 was around marine plastic debris and microplastics. And obviously we know that it's bigger than the ocean and the things that are in the ocean and things that are headed to the ocean, but that's where these conversations started. In the next UN Environment Assembly, it broadened a little, and it was marine plastic litter and microplastics. So not just debris, it was litter. So we're getting a little better in the words every 2 years. In 2017, we started talking about marine litter and plastic pollution, or marine litter and microplastics. And the interesting thing is in UNEP 3, the third UN Environment Assembly, that's where we really started to move forward, and it created an open-ended ad hoc open-ended expert group, which basically was the formation of the conversations around global responses to this issue. And I see I have a typo in there about 2018 to 2019. This continued for a number of years. So we talked, we held, I think, 5 meetings of the open-ended expert group, and we could have begun the treaty during and after those conversations. It was clear where we needed to go, but that was held up by industry and their allies, and we'll talk more about that later. So then we get to the 4th UN Environment Assembly, and this is where the expert group was supposed to be done with their work, but there was still a lot of resistance. So the 4th UN Environment Assembly then extended the work and the scope of the expert group, and then we continue to meet in the expert group 3 and 4. And then finally, we get to this momentous occasion in the 5th UN Environment Assembly, where we celebrated, and the ideology behind the expert group was finally taken into consideration, and we got all of the member countries to agree on language that would move forward, create an intergovernmental negotiating committee to pursue an legally binding instrument, an internationally legally binding instrument to, they said, end plastic pollution. It's meant to cover the full life cycle of plastic, which is an exciting thing for us to consider. However, what the life cycle of plastic means is different to different people. It's different to us, it's different to people on the front lines, and certainly it's different to people in the industry. So those terms have yet to be defined and negotiated, but the idea that we are looking at it from this lens is super important. It is a very aggressive timeline. The negotiations are meant to complete by the end of 2024. That's next year, everybody. That's the end of next year, like 18 months from now. So we've got some work to do. Once the UN Environment Assembly completed, and the picture in the lower right-hand corner is a photo of a bunch of our coalition all celebrating and crying and hugging when they declared this. So that this was, it brings tears to my eyes just looking at this photo, because it was such a tremendous moment and years and years and years of working. We had the first open-ended working group, which began the delineation of what these next steps would be, what they would look like, what the timing might be for these negotiation sessions. We were excited to have the first negotiation session in Uruguay just a few months ago, and that was it was slow going, but we're still forming the base of these conversations. And the next negotiation session is going to be in Paris in wow, just like the end of the month. Holy moly. So of these steps, there are countless. There are dozens and dozens of meetings and conferences and other fora where we've been working to support this and influence decision makers and members and delegations around the world, and it's been a lot of work. So some of the challenges I mentioned, that the industry is obviously a big challenge. Keep in mind, the industry's goal is to make money, and they honestly don't care how that happens. Corporate greed is just the most amazing thing on the planet, because people make decisions that literally impinge on our health, our lives, and the future of our planet and the future of our society. With the petrochemical industry playing a role, even in the negotiations, they show up, and they show up in force because they have a stake in the game, because our decisions could basically cost them bottom line. So they work hard to keep selling their wares, to convince us that there are other issues, that there are other problems, that we can solve this by recycling. They wrap recycling in a fancy new bow, and they call it chemical recycling or advanced recycling. And it's just burning plastic. And that never works. Anybody who has ever seen a tire burn and the stuff that comes out of that, yeah, you can capture that, you can put a filter on it, but it's still toxic and it's still hurting people. So human nature, I put this here because yes, there is some human nature involved, where people like what they like, and it's hard to get them to change their minds. Once people get used to something, it's harder to take that away from them. So we're used to convenience and single use and throwing things away. So there's a lot of talk of replacing alternatives to plastic. And honestly, sometimes the best alternative to a plastic thing is not another thing. It's the fact that we don't need that thing in the first place. So these are concepts we need to get back to. I like to say, what would grandma do? Because we think back to, bringing a box to the grocery store, or even like when if you get takeout food, there are places that will put it in a box instead of, giving you a plastic bag, or you bring your own things to the store if you have to do that. There's so many ways that we can approach this without creating more stuff. So single use, disposable, these are 4-letter words to me. False solutions. I think it's super important that we all keep an eye out for things like chemical recycling, advanced recycling, and things like this that are just misnomers and a fancy wrapper and different way for people to hide, for industry to hide the fact that they're trying to to burn plastic so that we don't have this problem. They often say, well, recycling, there's no recycling infrastructure in a given place, and that's the problem. It's not the problem. And the problem is that they're making stuff, selling it to people that can't do anything with it. So reusables are really the way to go. I put a couple of links here. One is our own landing page for COARE, our global policy landing page, but plasticstreaty.org is where we've been gathering a lot of folks, and we're going to see if we have a petition link on there. And I think that's all I have. So I'll throw up this page here for folks if they want to take a screenshot for contact info, but then I will pass it on to Jane.
Great, thanks so much, Christopher. Yes, please do check those websites, plasticstreaty.org, follow along, and we are looking for a link to a petition, which we'll share by the end. We hope to find that. So thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentations. We're going to go ahead with our second presenter, but any questions for Christopher, we can take them up at the end. Hopefully we'll have time for a robust discussion at the end of this. So now I'd like to introduce Jane Patton, campaign manager for plastics and petrochemicals with the Center for International Environmental Law. Jane works across their environmental health and climate and energy programs and serves as CIEL's organizational focal point for their work to protect human rights and the environment from the impacts of plastics across the full life cycle of plastics. She also coordinates the Global Civil Society and Rights Holders Coalition that is participating in the Plastics Treaty negotiations at the UN. Previously, Jane served 2 years as the managing director of the Plastic Pollution Coalition before moving on to help lead campaigns, organizing projects, and policy work at the Break Free from Plastic movement. Jane holds a BA in International Relations and Politics from the University of Essex and a Master of Public Policy from Georgetown University. And she's based in one of my favorite cities, New Orleans, Louisiana. So take it away, Jane.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's kind of funny to hear your whole life sort of condensed down into a couple sentences there. I am so glad to be here with you guys today, and I'm going to pick up where Christopher left off with that overview and go real deep for everybody who's a policy nerd like me on what has come out of where we are with the negotiation round. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. And just want to make sure, Gabby, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen? Because I can see you. Perfect. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Christopher. I like your enthusiastic thumbs up. So I'm going to jump right in just to cover where we are coming out of the first round of negotiation, which happened, as Christopher said, at the end of last year, and what we're gearing up for the negotiation coming at us very fast at the end of this month. So first, I want to acknowledge that there are several folks on this call who have been actively participating in this negotiation process since the beginning, and even some now actively participating as we're moving forward. We've got folks here from Break Free from Plastic. We have folks here from the Plastic Pollution Coalition. We've got folks here from Frontline Watch, from the Center for Biological Diversity, people who have really been participating and part of this from the beginning. So we have many experts on this call and hope that the follow-up that's done with folks can happen across people, not just with me and Christopher, as we are working to really share and spread leadership around this space. So I want to say that first, coming out of the first round of negotiation, we had some very, very exciting wins, and we had some deltas, some things that we would have preferred had gone differently. And I will say that the exciting things are that we saw a huge change in the narrative around plastics and the policy options on the table. Christopher already talked about some of those things, the shift from understanding of plastics as a marine issue to really looking across the life cycle. But we heard countries on the microphone talking about production reduction. talking about the impacts to human health, talking about environmental injustices across the plastics supply chain. That's never happened before. I know that those of us who are deep in the NGO space hear that messaging all the time, but hearing it from countries on the microphone, even ones that we had not previously thought of as being ambitious in this process, that is a big change. One of our partners, Healthcare Without Harm, actually went through and counted the number of countries that mentioned health on the first day of negotiation and the number of countries that mentioned health on the last day of negotiation, and that number almost tripled in a week. That's the significant impact that our advocacy and our messaging can have. And that was due in no small part to work from folks like Yvette Ariano on the call and the other frontline and fence line communities that are coming out of the US and countries around the world. So we saw that shift. We saw that discussion about a just transition and about a need to respond to the human rights violations that are happening across the plastic supply chain. And that is huge. We also saw those changes, not just in the negotiation space, but in country submissions into the second round of negotiations. When countries were asked, okay, what would you like to see in a treaty, and submitted their prepared comments, we saw across the more than 50, I think actually more than 60 submissions from countries, those same things show up again and again. And from the US even acknowledged the health implications of plastics across the supply chain, which is something we never would have seen from them even a year ago. So this is a significant response to our advocacy. There are still some roadblocks, and I do not want to underplay how important those roadblocks are. First of all, there is still an emphasis on the downstream. There is still a framing of plastics as a pollution problem and not a materials problem, which is something that we are working very hard on. There are still some countries who want to take the experience of the climate negotiation process and try to make the plastics treaty negotiation process equally as difficult. So we're seeing some countries push for all decisions be made by consensus, which, as we know, is not helpful when you have countries in the room who don't see climate as a problem, who don't see plastics production as a problem, and in fact want to continue emitting and producing. It's going to be a difficult process if we don't have a voting process there. And so we're seeing those pushes for consensus, which really is a push for delay. And as Christopher already highlighted, we're seeing a lot of misinformation around recycling, in particular chemical conversion, mislabeled as advanced recycling. We're seeing a lot of misinformation about that and a lot of countries supporting those technologies, despite the fact that they don't work and that they're very polluting. And speaking of polluting, the producers and the main users of plastics, which are the consumer goods companies, have a lot of influence into this process. They have a lot of access, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of people. And so that's part of what we're taking on and what we're trying to organize against is the influence of companies, not just like Coca-Cola and Nestle, but of Exxon, of Shell, of Chevron, who are all plastics producers and who all sent people to the negotiation round and will continue to do that. So they are really taking an active, influential role in the negotiation. Another good thing, though, just to sort of sandwich the bad in some good, is that we saw significant organizing for ambition specifically. So we saw countries come together in what they're calling the High Ambition Coalition, which is great. It's countries that are, their call to action manifesto from the HAC, the High Ambition Coalition. I love that acronym. Their manifesto specifically calls for reductions in production, and it specifically calls for elimination of toxic chemicals. Those are huge things that we are seeing coming out of the HAC, and they're very selective about which members which countries can be members. The U.S. actually has shown interest in being a member of the HAC, and the HAC has said, well, can you agree to these things that are in our manifesto? And the U.S. has said no, and the HAC has said, well, then you can't be in the club. So there's actually they're trying to protect that level of ambition in the hack, which is good. We're also seeing the scientific community really come together. The Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, which is a very exciting space. Right now, still quite dominated by the global north, by the US, Canada, and Western Europe. We are working, the folks who are facilitating and working in that group are in earnest recruiting and onboarding more scientists from the global South, from regions like Latin America and Africa, where some of the key sort of predatory waste exports and things like that are happening. And that is a process underway. But for right now, that coalition is representative across regions. And it's very exciting that scientists are coming together and calling for, again, production reduction, elimination of toxicity, really key things that we are also looking for on the policy side. And then, of course, we have lots of organizing across the non-governmental groups. Christopher mentioned Break Free from Plastic and the coalition. Chris mentioned it, the Civil Society and Rights Holders Coalition that we are all part of and facilitating. We also have significant input from amazing groups with time-tested history on influencing both global treaties and policy generally, from IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, from the Break Free from Plastic movement, from what the UN calls their major group system, which is Indigenous peoples, women, children, and youth. We're seeing these constituencies also organized to input for an effective treaty and doing some really effective advocacy, both on the ground in the negotiation space and in the time between. And of course, we have an organized delegation from the US broadly, and also specifically from the environmental justice and frontline community in the US, which has been really serving as a moral center of gravity, not just in influencing the US, but in influencing the whole process. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, and would encourage folks to follow up with Yvette and Graham Hamilton, the policy director for BFFP US, who's on the call, who's doing some support for that group. So definitely a huge win there on the side for organizing and for pushing for ambition. I also want to say that the waste pickers of the world are also very organized around this process, and hearing from them in the process is really powerful and influential with countries because they are a key labor group. There are, of course, other labor groups that need to be organized and part of this process, not least of which is folks who work in petrochemical production. But at least we are seeing some real significant participation for the waste pickers, which, as y'all can imagine, are a typically underrepresented group. And there was even waste picker representation from the United States in the delegation that came to the first round of negotiation, which is very exciting. I do just want to quickly give a couple of updates on some of the key players in the process so far. Christopher outlaid how the negotiations go, the fact that we're going to do multiple rounds, but there's some players that are interesting for us to just have an eye on. There's the Bureau, which is the 10 countries that sort of guide and lead this process. The chair of the Bureau is Peru. We have not yet actually finalized all 10 members because the Russian invasion of Ukraine has actually created an issue with the Eastern European appointments and delegates. And so that will probably be our first act of voting at the INC2 later this month. And we can talk more about that later if you would like. We also have the Secretariat, which is the staff hired by UNEP to drive this process. We have UNEP itself, the UN Environment Program, which has its own staff and is helping to support and drive this process. UNEP has an element called the Civil Society Unit, which does support for folks like us. Some level of support for folks like us, not always perfect. And then we have several industry players that are important here in different groups. One is, as I already mentioned, the plastics producers. Another is the consumer goods companies, the Coca-Colas, the Nestle's, which are a different group. And a lot of those folks are organized into a coalition called the Business Coalition that is facilitated by WWF and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. They have a lot of influence over this process. A lot of it is bad, not all of it is bad. They are pushing for false solutions, but they are also, I think, in many ways, serving to separate the interests of the plastics producers who are not part of that coalition from the consumer goods companies who are part of that coalition. And that is a very interesting development in the way that the negotiations are going. And it is still to be determined how that's going to play out and what that influence is going to look like throughout the rest of the process. But know that we are keeping a very close eye on it. Going into INC2, we have some key things on the agenda that I think it's important for folks to know about. First is that we'll finalize the Bureau. As I already mentioned, there is some spillover geopolitical tensions. None of this stuff happens in a vacuum, unfortunately. The main piece of the agenda is we're going to be discussing the options for treaty elements. What that means is we're going to be talking about what the treaty does, what it covers, and what goes in it. I know you're thinking, don't we already know that? But we actually don't know that. We actually haven't agreed. What does the treaty cover exactly? Like, what is its objective? What is it trying to do? And what are its elements? We have not actually agreed on that and barely begun to negotiate it. So that's what we're going to be really core talking about in this meeting in Paris. And we're going to be doing that in 2 negotiation rooms running in parallel, which is good. In the first round of negotiation, we only had 1 room. Now we have 2, so we can hopefully be a little bit more effective and efficient with the time that we have before us. There are some key outcomes that we are looking for both at CIEL, but also across the broader Break Free from Plastic movement and the coalition, the civil society coalition that we've mentioned. We are looking for a member-driven process coming out of INC2, and we want that process to be driven by members of the High Ambition Coalition. And when I say members, I mean like a country-driven process. A member is a country. Those are the ones who are members of the INC. And we want there to be a plan for work between the rounds of negotiation. So not just waiting until we're all in the room together in person to be moving some of this work forward, to be meeting bilaterally, which is, just between 1 or 2 or a small number of countries. We want this work to move forward between those formal sessions. And we want countries to be reinforcing the OECD definition of plastic pollution, which includes emissions across the life cycle and is not just talking about like physical pollution or polymers in the environment. So we're going to be advocating for and pushing for that. And as I already mentioned, we're looking for rules for the negotiation and for the eventual treaty that include voting, not just consensus. So that's not 100% done yet, mostly because countries are taking advantage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Again, the geopolitics spilling over. And we're going to be pushing really hard for those rules of procedure to stay as they are, which includes a voting process. So also just wanted to touch very briefly on what's next, because the second round of negotiation is in 3.5 weeks, but then we have 3 more rounds after that, and then we have the signing of the eventual treaty. And just for a little fun, there might be some additional pieces negotiated after it's signed, which is always a fun process. But there will be a lot of work in the next 6 months. We expect that coming out of INC2, countries will actually begin putting pen to paper and drafting some text, which is about time and also a little nerve-wracking. And so we're going to be pushing on how that process is done, who holds the pen metaphorically on that, like who is leading on the writing and how they're being influenced. We expect that there will be a number of webinars for information sharing, for question answering. There will be bilateral and multilateral country meetings, which means sometimes it'll be, 2 countries meeting. Sometimes it'll be 20 countries meeting. Sometimes it's the whole region. We will try to influence those meetings with countries as much as possible. And when I say we, I mean across all of civil society, not just CIEL. So we, and certainly not just COARE either. We will be doing all of this work in coordination with a lot of organizations. And that will happen both one-to-one from organizations to countries and capital, but we also are going to work very hard to be in those meeting spaces as much as possible so that it is a transparent and participatory process. And just wanted to quickly put a little bit more detail on that calendar that Christopher went through. which is when the rounds of negotiation happen. They're roughly every 6 months until we get this thing done. And the signing ceremony, which they call the Conference of Plenipotentiaries, and I have never once spelled that word correctly, never once. That will happen in early 2025. And all that means is like who's designated by a country's leader to sign the document. That's what a plenipotentiary is. And so that will happen in early 2025, likely in Ecuador. And so, again, just wanted to make sure you had my contact information, and I'll put my email in the chat as well. And then I think we have some good time for questions. So I'll go ahead and stop my screen share.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane and Christopher. This is such inspiring work. It's such a huge problem, and it is at once daunting and also hopeful that there's such a concerted effort going forward. We do have some good time for a discussion, and we have a few questions coming in the chat. I'm going to go back to it. Earlier question in a minute, but Deanna has one that I think kind of just touched on to get the conversation started, and that is Jane and Christopher, what do you believe are the most important goals of this treaty?
You want to go first, or
yes? Oh yeah, go ahead.
There are so many important things in here, and so many things that are crucial to what some would consider success. I would put near the top an agreed reduction in the production of plastics and plastic products. We cannot continue to make what we at COARE call stupid plastics any longer. And included in the stupid plastics are actually the dangerous ones. We really need to phase out and ban toxicants in the production and creation of plastic. So there are toxic materials that are used to create plastics, and there are toxic materials in plastics, like this big thing in Ohio. We like the fact that we're making things like PVC and using hazardous materials like this are just it's inexcusable. So those are two of the biggest concerns, and also doing this in a just manner and recognizing the fact that vulnerable populations are feeling the brunt of this and are dying, literally dying at a disproportionate rate is inexcusable. So those are probably the top three asks for us. But yeah, there's so many different pieces that really come into play.
Thanks, Christopher. I think we strongly agree with a lot of those pieces. And also, I want to answer this question in sort of two different ways. The first one is, and thank you, Deanna, for the question, because I think that's really core to this whole piece. The first is that the treaty is going to have a formal objective. It's going to be sort of the first article of the treaty. The first element will be what its objective is and what it covers. And right now, the resolution coming out of UNEP 5.2 mentioned end plastic pollution and its adverse impacts. And what we are seeing now is countries coalesce around both ending plastic pollution and addressing its harmful and negative impacts on human health. So those two elements coupled together, right? Not just ending the adverse impacts and not just ending a limited definition of plastic pollution, but looking at those two things together as an objective in the sort of formal objective of the treaty is something we're really looking for. Building on what Christopher was just saying, the other way I want to answer this is that CIEL will consider this an effective treaty if we come out with an instrument that is not just legally binding itself, but that has legally binding provisions, that has mandatory provisions for countries to limit plastics production, as a material and to limit its use as a product. And so that's the other key element that we're looking for is, yes, we want to be looking at the production and the toxic chemical side of plastics. We want to be pushing down production, but we don't just want to be, for instance, eliminating only products that are, or plastic production that is labeled as problematic. We want to be limiting all plastics production. We want to be eliminating all toxics in the production phase, so that, as Christopher said, we are not harming anybody's health for the sake, or safety or livelihood for the sake of this product or this material. And we want to see significant limitations on the use and significant limitations on applications of plastics as a material and as a product. It's those two things together that are going to functionally drive down the plastics, the problem that we have with the plastics crisis. And that's really what CIEL is looking for from this treaty in a broader, so one of those is what is the objective, and the other one is how do we do it? And we're looking for both of those pieces.
Great, great. Thank you, Jane and Christopher. I'm going to go to an earlier comment. I'm going to try and phrase it as a little bit of a question. So we're pulling out a little bit from the treaty here, but addressing Christopher's comment earlier. This is from Ina Balik, addressing Christopher's comment on corporate greed as one of the aspects of this and the fundamental issue. Do free trade agreements impinge on environmental regulations and the ability of environmental law to make change, or are they going to still remain subservient to international trade law?
I think you've really hit the nail on the head with one of the key problems of this issue, and one of the key things that folks like us are constantly organizing and railing against. I will say that the WTO actually does have its own process on plastics running now, called I think it's the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution, the DPP. That is a process in which they are talking about the plastic pollution, how it comes about, what could be the trade responses to it. CIEL has a team member, a lawyer, who is engaged in that process. There are very few civil society actors engaged in that process. I think CIEL might be one of two. Most of the focus is right now on the plastics treaty, but there is signals that are being sent across those two spaces. And as the treaty moves forward, there are going to be signals sent to the WTO process of where countries are negotiating on these pieces, what they're pushing for in terms of preventative measures to address plastic pollution, and how those two things are speaking to each other. That does not happen organically. You have to make international policy processes talk to each other. And that's part of the role that NGOs and civil society advocates will play, is being in all of those spaces all at once, with all of the resources that we have at our disposal, I'm saying with sarcasm, and really making sure that we are pushing those processes to be aligned, to be complementary, and so that we don't end up in a situation that I think Ina's touching on here, which is that the treaty space says, oh no, that's a job for the WTO. And the WTO is saying, oh no, that's a job for the treaty. And then nobody's actually doing it. That's a space that we've ended up in many times before. And that's part of why it's so powerful for us to be operating as a coalition that has folks really moving in different places, including other environmental treaties that we haven't even talked about, to really be pushing this forward. We are trying to take lessons from the process under the climate negotiation and from other restrictions and control measures. It will not be perfect, and we need more support, but that's where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for tackling that. Christopher, did you have a response, or should we move on?
No, we can move on. That was a fantastic response.
Okay, thanks. There's also another question here from Jennifer Bracetta. Hope I pronounced your name correctly. it addresses the fact that the U.S. has not signed on to the Basel Convention. And the question here would be, can the U.S. opt out of this treaty if it's passed? How do we ensure that these world rules apply to the biggest consumers of chemical goods? And Jane, I think you've indicated you wanted to answer that.
I would love to, but also want to hear Christopher's thoughts on it and hope the next question is for him. So I only want to answer it because, one, I'm such a nerd, and two, CIEL has done some writing on this, and I'm just very eager to drop a brief in the link in the chat. So I want to clarify, the US actually can't opt out of the Basel Convention. We have signed it, but we've not ratified it. But the Basel Convention contains what are called strong non-party provisions, which means it says even for countries that are not party to the Basel Convention, there are limitations on what countries party to the Basel Convention can do with countries not party to the Basel Convention. And just for clarity, for those who don't follow international law processes, the Basel Convention is the Convention on the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste. And what that means is that it's the limitations on countries like no global north. You cannot just ship all of your toxic, dangerous waste overseas. We're going to put some limits on that because that's what countries like the US and others were doing for a long time. Because the Basel Convention is ratified by almost the entire world except the United States, any country that we want to trade or export our toxic waste to is party to the Basel Convention, which means we still have to abide by it because they have to abide by it. And so that's actually something that we are pushing for inclusion in the plastics treaty as well. And if you would like to dive deep on a level that was written by a lawyer and not just glibly summarized by me here, you can check out this briefing that was written by my colleague Heli, whose last name is French, and I'm probably gonna botch it, but she's the one who is really holding down our work at the WTO and is really thinking deeply about these trade provisions. And if you ever want to have a direct conversation with Heli about trade work, I think that would be lovely, and I would be happy to facilitate that. But several of the staff at CIEL, including David Azoulay, who's our lead attorney on this, have experience with both not negotiating the Basel Convention, because that happened in the early 80s when most of us were still young, but at least in implementing its processes and making sure that we are living up to those elements. So again, this is something we're going to be pushing very hard. It's not a done deal, and we are going to be looking for closing all of the loopholes, but we have done quite a lot of deep thinking on this process. Thanks, Christopher, for letting me answer another question in a row.
The only thing that I would add is that the United States rarely ratifies multilateral environmental agreements. They happily become parties to a number of these, but they rarely ratify them. And one of the, I guess, the points that some US delegates like to make is that if they're trying to water down language, or they're trying to reduce the level of provisions, they'll say, well, we want the US to be able to ratify this, so we never ratify this, so we need to drop that down. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't matter where it's going to end up, the US will likely not ratify this treaty, so we need to be able to hold them accountable. And one of the ways that we do that is with the non-party provisions and also global peer pressure. Like, the US does not want to be an outlier in any of these agreements.
Great, that's a great point. I learned something really big today on that. Another question here coming from Lisa Carter, talking about youth involvement. What can youth do that want to be part of this process? What is the opportunity to center the voices of youth in these negotiations? What meaningful ways can they engage?
I'll go ahead and start with this. One of the what I would call kryptonite for lawmakers and for public servants is the youth voice. And they can hardly say no to a group of young people coming to their offices or showing up or calling and asking for something. So it's hard to look a child in the face and tell them, no, your future is not important to me. This single-use disposable cup is more important to me than your future, than your life. So we need to kind of coalesce these voices and bring you to meetings where possible, bring you to the decision makers, and have you show your voices, show your concern, and continue to rally around the things that are important for our and for your survival. So it's sort of like dying down in the global press, but Fridays for Future is tremendous, and that catches people's attention. So yeah, keep on it.
And I also just want to tack onto that there is an organized force with children and youth through the major group system that I mentioned a few minutes ago. They are a rights holding constituency. Children have protected rights under international law, and it is important that those be asserted and that those be part of the conversation. And so the children and youth major group, which I have to admit is mostly made up of youth and not children, and the youth definition for UNEP is quite broad. I have only recently aged out of being a UNEP youth. So just for clarity on how big and broad that category is. But there's some really incredible advocates from across the world that are part of that children and youth major group, many of whom are closer to the children's side than the youth side, but there could always be more. And I think that engaging with them would be really powerful. You can actually find the contact information of the Children and Youth Major Group Facilitating Committee. They have 2 co-facilitators. You can find that on UNEP's website if you Google it. I can find it for you, but you'll have to give me a second. And they are really young people crafting their own messages, doing their own organizing, and holding their own in the coalition, in the Civil Society and Rights Holders Coalition, and demanding their voices be heard and making sure that they are recognized as the rights holding constituency that they are. And so definitely Lisa and others who work directly with youth, I think engaging directly with that group would be fabulous.
Great. Thanks. And thanks everyone for the questions that are coming in. This is really great discussion. We have time for just a couple more. So I'm sort of prioritizing people that haven't asked yet. And I want to go to a question from Julie Simmons, which is, how do we best approach the low ambition, highest polluting consuming block? What's the best strategy for ensuring they do not water the treaty down, yet are brought along so limits apply to them?
They say that power comes from one of 2 places. You either have to have money or you have to have people. So if we are going to be pushing on these countries who, the low ambition, highest polluting countries, are typically some of the world's most powerful countries. And if we are going to be pushing on them, we need people. We need organized groups of organizations, coalitions of organizations. We need folks in country and folks at the negotiating space. I think this is one of the least understood parts of this treaty process. And I think it's something, the reason why Christopher and I do these webinars and are engaging with folks in the way that we do, is that going to the negotiation is actually not the most powerful space for most folks to be engaging in this process. Some of us will go to the negotiation, and some of us will, metaphorically and sometimes literally bang our heads on a table until 3 o'clock in the morning while countries debate a comma. And if you think that hasn't happened, it will take both of my hands to count the number of times I have experienced that personally, just in the last few years. But everyone doesn't have to do that. It's resource intensive, it's time intensive, it's preparation intensive. I think what is important is for folks to be pushing on their own governance. And that's where we're doing this, outreach to folks, not just in the US, but You know, I was just in Nairobi a couple of weeks ago, talking to folks who are in, I think, 11 or 12 different countries in Africa, talking about how we do this, not just in the treaty space, but at the national level. The Break Free from Plastic movement is taking advantage of its thousands of members. I think that's correct. I think I can say thousands factually across the world, to engage their own countries. So even if you don't go to a negotiation space, you can do, as CBD and others have done, write letters to the US government. You can write letters to US congresspeople. You know, the presidential administration is not the only source of power and influence in this country. Show them that you are looking at this, that you know, at least on a high level, what is happening with the treaty, that you are following them, that you are going to be holding them accountable, and that you expect more from them. Because right now, the US wants to be like, we are ambitious, and they're not. And this is a big problem. And so part of it is we need to define for them what ambition is, and they need to hear it over and over and over and over again, and not just from Christopher's delightful face and my very loud voice, but and I don't mean to be reductive of either of us, but not just from us all the time, from organized groups, from influential and powerful groups, especially if you're a group like Waterkeeper with a strong membership base. That is something that the US government really needs to hear, and they need to hear it often. And so that is how I would answer that, is to push on the governments, even if you're not engaged in the negotiation process.
I would
and
like
that
to.
was a wonderful segue, because I just put in the chat a link to a petition where you can petition the US government to take stronger action on this. So please take a look at that. It's an Action Network petition. We are unfortunately running out of time, and I don't know if I was able to get to all of the questions. So I just want to thank everybody for attending. If you have any follow-up, please feel free to, I hope it's okay, to email either of our presenters. It's a very engaged group that we have today, and I just thank everybody for taking time to attend this. And yeah, Jane has put another link in the chat there, so please take a look at that. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Gabby for running the show here. Such a great job. And I also wanted to let everybody know about our next webinar for this series. I will put a little blurb for that in the chat, but it is on Thursday, June 1st at 4 p.m. Eastern time in the US, 1 p.m. Pacific time. And just as a little teaser, it is called Two Truths and a Lie. So there you go. And this is will be the next installment in the Solutions to Plastic Pollution webinar series. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for attending. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of your questions, but please stay tuned and watch this space, because this is very exciting work. Thanks to our presenters and all of the attendees.
Thank y'all.
Everyone.